welcome to Talking About English, the podcast that makes learning English enjoyable, practical, and simple to grasp. I'm Julia, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join me today. In this episode, we're diving into the past perfect tense, one of the most fascinating used tenses in English. It's essential for discussing past experiences, actions that connect to other moments in the past, and so much more. Whether you're learning English, teaching it, or just curious about grammar, you've come to the right place. I'm also thrilled to have a special guest with me today. Please join me in welcoming Rick, an experienced English teacher and language expert. Rick, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Julia. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here on Talking About English. The past perfect tense. Did you know that even native English speakers often struggle with its proper use?
Oh, that's an intriguing way to look at it. So, how exactly does it work?
Well, the mechanics are surprisingly simple. You use had plus the past participle of the verb. For example, you had studied English before you moved to New York. It's a straightforward structure, but its implications for storytelling are profound.
I see. So if we wanted to turn that into a question, we'd just flip it around, right?
Exactly. You'd say, had you studied English before you moved to New York? And for negatives, we simply add not after had. Like, you had not studied English before you moved to New York. It's a versatile tense that allows for a range of expressions.
That makes sense. You know, I've noticed something interesting. Sometimes people use the past perfect with verbs like live, work, teach, and study, even though they're not typically non-continuous verbs. Is that correct? Or are people just getting it wrong?
That's a great observation. It's actually one of those quirks of English. While it's not the norm, these verbs are indeed sometimes used in the past perfect, even though they're generally continuous verbs. It's one of those exceptions that make English both fascinating and, well, frustrating for learners.
Oh, I see. So it's not exactly wrong, but it's not the typical usage either. Now, I'm curious about when we actually use the past perfect. I understand there are a couple of main uses.
You're right on track. The first and most common use is to express a completed action before something else in the past. For instance, I had never seen such a beautiful beach before I went to Kauai. This use helps establish a clear sequence of events in past narratives.
So it's like creating a backstory within your main story. Can you give us another example to really drive this point home?
Sure. Consider this. Tony knew Istanbul so well because he had visited the city several times. Here, Tony's previous visits explain his familiarity with the city. It provides context and depth to the narrative, showing how past experiences influence later events.
That really clarifies it for me. I can see how this would be particularly useful when you're telling a story and need to provide some background information or explain why something happened.
Absolutely. Now, let's move on to the second use, which is a bit trickier. It's for expressing duration before something in the past, but only with non-continuous verbs. This use really showcases the nuanced nature of the past perfect.
Oh, that does sound more complex. Could you break that down for us with an example?
Certainly. Let's take this example. We had had that car for 10 years before it broke down. Here, had is our non-continuous verb, and we're showing how long we owned the car before another past event occurred. It's not just about sequence, but also about duration in some cases.
I think I'm starting to get it. So it's not just about what happened before what, but also about how long something had been going on. That's really interesting.
Exactly. You're grasping the subtleties of this tense very well. Now, here's something that often surprises English learners about the past perfect. Unlike the present perfect, you can actually use specific time words or phrases with it.
Really? That is surprising. I always thought you couldn't use specific times with perfect tenses. How does this work in practice?
Well, you could say, she had visited her Japanese relatives once, in 1993 before she moved in with them in 1996. This level of specificity isn't possible with the present perfect, but the past perfect allows for it. However, it's worth noting that this isn't always necessary and depends on the context of your story.
That's good to know. It seems like the past perfect offers a lot of flexibility. Are there any cases where using the past perfect is absolutely necessary?
Great question. There are indeed cases where the past perfect is crucial. If you're not referring to a specific time, but rather a general experience, you need to use the past perfect. For example, she had never seen a bear before she moved to Alaska is correct, while she never saw a bear before she moved to Alaska is not.
Oh, I see. So it's all about the context and what exactly you're trying to convey. The past perfect seems to add a layer of nuance that the simple past just can't capture in certain situations.
Precisely. Now, let's talk about something that often confuses learners: adverb placement in past perfect sentences. Adverbs like always, never, just, etc. usually go between had and the past participle.
Could you give us an example of how this works in practice?
Sure. Consider this sentence. You had previously studied English before you moved to New York. See how previously sits between had and studied? This placement emphasizes the sequence of events and the fact that the studying happened before the move.
I think I've got it. And I assume this applies to questions as well?
In questions, the structure would be, had you previously studied English before you moved to New York? The adverb still comes after the subject, maintaining its position between had and the past participle.
One last thing I'm curious about. How does the past perfect work with active and passive voice?
The past perfect can be used in both active and passive voice. In the active voice, you might say, George had repaired many cars before he received his mechanic's license. In the passive, it would be, many cars had been repaired by George before he received his mechanic's license.
I see. So the core concept of the past perfect doesn't change, but we adapt it to fit different sentence structures. That's really fascinating.
Exactly. Now, let's put this knowledge to the test. Here's a practice problem. How would you use the past perfect to describe a situation where you arrived at a party, but all the food was gone? Think about it for a moment.
Well, I think I'd say something like, by the time I arrived at the party, all the food had been eaten.
That's spot on. You've used the past perfect to show that the eating happened before your arrival. Now, let's try another one. How would you use the past perfect to explain why you were tired on a Monday morning? Take a moment to think about it.
Oh, I've got this one. I was tired on Monday morning because I had stayed up late watching movies on Sunday night.
Excellent. You're really getting the hang of this. You've used the past perfect to explain a past state, being tired, with an earlier past action, staying up late.
This has been such an enlightening discussion. I feel like I have a much better grasp of the past perfect now. Do you have any final thoughts or tips for our listeners who might be struggling with this tense?
Absolutely. The key is practice and context. Try to incorporate the past perfect into your everyday English. When you're telling a story about past events, think about the sequence and see if you can use the past perfect to make that sequence clearer. Also, pay attention to how it's used in books, movies, and conversations.
That's great advice. And I suppose it's worth reminding our listeners that even native English speakers sometimes struggle with the past perfect, so they shouldn't be too hard on themselves if it takes some time to master.
You're absolutely right. Language learning is a journey, and every step forward is progress. The past perfect is a powerful tool in your English toolkit, and with practice, you'll be using it confidently in no time.
Well said. I think we've given our listeners plenty to think about and practice with. Any last words before we wrap up?
Yes, I'd like to emphasize that mastering the past perfect isn't just about following rules. It's about enriching your storytelling and adding depth to your communication. In the world of grammar, as in life, it's not just about where you are, but where you had been that shapes your story. So keep practicing, keep exploring, and most importantly, enjoy the process of becoming a more articulate and expressive communicator.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you all for tuning in to Talking About English. Until next time, keep exploring the fascinating world of language.